of course, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what goes on in my book, Humanity 2.0. So if you want to find out more about what I'm saying here, there is this book that's just been published this week. But I want to fit this into the theme of the conference, and I think that this is exactly the right group to talk about this issue with, because you're called Humanity Plus, and so far no one has really talked much about what does humanity mean in this context. Right? I mean, so far it seems to me from the first round of speakers that we've had that basically we're working with a kind of slightly enhanced Humanity 1.0 conception. So in other words, we're working with human beings as, let's say, as understood in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but perhaps with a few more technological enhancements, either internally or externally, as the case may be. But I think we're now entering into a period where people are thinking much more radically about what it means to be human, and whether human is a relevant, normatively relevant category. Right? In other words, should this be a central category under which we organize society, organize the way we understand the world, and so forth? If you were here in the first session, I posed a question to Kirsten about whether our increased interaction with robots was in fact erasing the ontological boundary between ourselves and robots, to the extent that robots in the future might provide a kind of normative standard against which we judge our own performance if we interact with them enough. And she didn't take the bait, right? She basically, is she here? It's even better. Then I could say anything I want. No, but the point that she raised was that human beings are, these maximally adaptive creatures. Right, and so in a sense, insofar as we manage to get on with robots and be able to deal with them in creative ways, it has to do with some sort of inherent potential in us as human beings. Right, so giving that kind of an answer, which is actually quite a familiar answer from philosophical anthropology in the 20th century, which was a sort of school of philosophy, which actually defined the human being in that way, as this kind of indefinitely plastic creature, this kind of unfinished creature, kind of leaves open that human can go in any direction whatsoever and still remain human. Okay, at least, human enough in the sense that we have traditionally thought about wanting to preserve the human. And I think that's a really open question right now. Now, the first thing I think I should be making here as a point from the standpoint of sociology and the social sciences generally, because we really haven't made this point yet, is that regardless of what the state of our science and technology is today, people are expecting Humanity 2.0. Okay, and so we may quibble about whether this is going to happen 20 years from now or 200 years from now, but the point is we are already in a sort of frame of mind where we want to redefine the boundaries of what it is to be human. And I'll give you some examples of where I think this is coming from. I think the first thing to say is the meltdown of the nation state. Okay, because the nation state in the modern era has been traditionally the protector of a sort of classical notion of the human. Right, and you think about the welfare state in particular, right, where there's a sense in which all human beings, regardless of their, economic situation, regardless of their culture and so forth, are equally protected under the law, and the law going quite deep to sort of provide education, health, and so forth. And all people are equal, in the eyes of the state as citizens. Okay, now that's a very sort of classical notion, and this is where civil rights and human rights dovetail with each other. Now, I think, when I was born in 1959, this was patently obvious. Okay, I think now this is much more up for grabs. And a lot has to do with the fact that the state is no longer seen as this kind of universal protector. So the boundaries have become very open and very porous, and there is a question about if you want to protect this kind of classical notion of the human, where do you go? Okay, and so that's an interesting point. And one of the things that you're seeing, for example, is not only is there sort of a meltdown of the state in terms of the state budgets suffering from deficit and as a result not being able to do all those state-like activities that protected human beings in the past, but also there's a general disaffection on the part of especially the younger generation with the conventional political distinctions, which as it were offered sort of classically alternative visions of what it is to be human, whether we're talking about conservative, liberal, or socialist. Okay, there's a kind of disaffection with all of them. And instead what we see in terms of spontaneous political activity is we see a rise on the one hand religiously based politics. We often call this fundamentalist, and that's a kind of interesting word to use in this context, because in a sense what we're talking about are people who are trying to reconnect at the most fundamental level with their being, right, in terms of their relationship with God or something like that, right? In other words, trying to find some metaphysical grounding for their politics. But the same thing is also happening, you might say, on the other side in terms of racial-based politics, right? And in some sense that the state ought to be reorganized along those boundaries. So in a sense, you're having now this distinction, right, between the religious orientation and the racial orientation revisits a very sort of classical dualism in the way in which we define our human being historically. Right? On the one hand, there's this kind of spiritual basis that transcends political divisions and so forth, and especially if you look at Christianity and Islam, that's kind of where the religious fundamentalist sentiment is coming from. But on the other hand, there's this more biologically based notion of the human, where in a sense the human is a kind of generic category under which there may be, as it were, subspecies, each of which is entitled to its own environment where it can live in a relatively self-contained way. And this is the basis of racialist politics, okay? And so these things are being revisited now in new ways in light of new political situations as well as in light of new scientific situations. But the point is that the sort of classical understanding of the politics of the state, where you have people from many different ethnic backgrounds, many different religious backgrounds, nevertheless covered under the same set of laws, that is under doubt. That's an interesting point. Another interesting point is we actually have a sort of active campaign to make people expect and want the kinds of things that we were talking about in the first session. And in the field that I'm in the sociology of science, there's this thing called anticipatory governance. Now this sort of idea originated with an initiative that was taken by the US National Science Foundation back in 2002, which is often called the Converging Technologies Agenda. And we've already seen this alluded to this morning, and it has to do with the idea that science policy agencies, in order to maintain a sort of increasingly prosperous and secure future for its citizens, ought to be in the business of providing incentives for people who are working in the nanosciences and technology, biosciences and technology, information sciences and technology, and the cognitive sciences and technology to pool their efforts together, to work in a common direction. In other words, instead of just going off into their disciplinary silos, which is quite the sort of default position for a lot of academic research, that in fact they should be moving closer together to provide the kinds of means by which we can enhance, and this word gets used in that context, in that policy context, enhance the human condition. And this can be understood in terms of enabling people to work longer so they don't have to get pensions so early, and as a result we might be able to alleviate the budgetary problems. Okay, in terms of national security, making people stronger, okay, immune to bio-warfare, right? There's a lot of different contexts in which this kind of thing has been promoted. And one of the ways it's been promoted isn't just by funding the sort of basic research that's necessary, because I think the people who came up with this agenda realizes what Professor Moriarty was saying, this is going to be a long time in the making. You really do need to invest in basic research. But what you also want to do is you want to invest in the expectation on the part of the citizenry that this is going to come on stream, that they should be wanting this, not to be scared by it. Okay, that's a very important point too. You need to have both things going on, because as Professor Moriarty was saying, a lot of this research is going to take a long time to come to fruition, but in the meanwhile, people have to be on board with it. Okay? And they also have to be on board with it even if it, has a few disastrous consequences along the way. They can't just stop it when things go bad. And so what you're getting now is you're getting a lot of social scientists who are working in this area of what's called anticipatory governance. And what that means is basically you encourage people to think about things that might be possible in the future. So the brain-boosting drugs, for example. I mean, some of the things that Anders was talking about today, right? He tells you on the one hand, this stuff might not happen tomorrow. It'll take a long time. We got to be cautious. But at the same time, he's putting the idea in your head. Right? So there's a sense in which there's a kind of a PR job going on here, as well as the caution. Because look, if this stuff is so far in the future, why talk about it now? Right? But because there's a sense in which you want to get people prepared. Okay? And also, the ways in which anticipatory governance occurs is through things like focus groups, by the use of Wikimedia, for example, whereby people are participating and, as it were, projecting their own imaginations into what kinds of futures would they find acceptable that would be able to incorporate this new science and technology. Okay? And so that then, as it were, enrolls them into the process. Right? So they become, in a way, partially committed to the outcome. And that then makes them more favorably disposed, you know, when you, let's say, have to make decisions about where you're going to put your money. Okay? So that's going on right now, and a lot of people in my field are very much involved in it. And I stated in this kind of bold, a lot of people think I'm really against this. I think one should see this with open eyes. That's all I'm saying. Right? And not just have this kind of slipped under the, you know, under the rug, but that we be very open that this is actually actively going on right now. So regardless of whether the innovations actually come on stream soon, you're expecting them, right? And you're mentally prepared for them when they happen. Okay, now the third thing that I think is also going on now, which in a way makes this issue a really live issue from a sort of, you might say, deep ontological standpoint, is if you look at how people, as it were, are voting with their feet with regard to the affective ties that they are forming these days. Okay, and it's not just with other humans 1.0, right? You're having increasing affiliations with animals, okay, and also increasing affiliations with androids, robots, whatever you want to call them, or even, you know, you don't have to get that sophisticated. You can talk about your PC. The kinds of relationships that people have with their PCs today, it's amazing. No, and this is quite an important point, because part of what I was trying to tap into when I asked Kirsten about you know, whether the ontological divide was breaking down between humans and androids and robots, is I had in the back of my mind the kinds of research some of you may be familiar with from people like Sherry Turkle, for example, who over the past 25 years has been examining the way in which children, right, who are raised in front of computers, right, start transferring their emotions to those machines, personify them, and, as it were, adjust to them, but incorporate them as very much part of their life world. And they become, as it were, normal members and respond to them with the same sort of emotional depth as they would to a human being. Okay, and this is research has been going on for 25 years. The spirit of Turkle's ethnographies of this has been largely critical, right? Because she thinks there's just some kind of deformation going on here. Okay, and of course another person who thinks that that our increased interaction with computers is warping our little brains is Susan Greenfield. I mean, she's a total nightmare, frankly. But the point is, there are people out. The presupposition of what she's saying is that indeed some kind of barrier is being broken, right? And that people, in some sense, are unduly influenced by computers. And somehow the computers are rewiring our minds, precisely because, as Kirsten was saying, we're such plastic creatures. And the way that plasticity is working is somehow against what humans are supposed to be. So we go back to the question of what is it that humans are supposed to be? Because if we're talking about humanity plus, right, or humanity 2.0, what is the better thing we should be that is in some sense a continuation of the past? Okay? How much more time do I have, Maestro?
15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay.
You can leave some time for Q&A if you like. You don't need to talk all the time. It's up to you.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize. I thought we were going to have a panel. We're not having a panel?
Yeah, we're going to have a panel too.
Okay, I won't go on forever. Okay, can you tell me when it's 5 minutes so I can take a couple of questions at the end, okay? All right. I was about to give you the history of the concept of humanity, but obviously 10 minutes is not going to allow me that, but I want to give you the highlights.
12 minutes.
No, come on, I'll be fair. I think the first point to be made about the concept of humanity is that it was always regarded as an artificial thing. In other words, even if we go back to the Greeks, and you know, we talk about humanitas in the Romans, it was something you got trained into being. In other words, you start up with the upright ape, Homo sapiens, which itself is only an 18th century coinage, but let's not go there right now. But the point is, you start with a biological being. The kinds of biological beings, Homo sapiens, that are eligible for being human in the proper sense, that is to say, to be able to speak for oneself, right? The idea of having the sort of authority to be recognized as an equal in the public forum. That was the classical definition of what a human being was, right? That was really an elite privilege, okay? And it was what we might call artificial. It required training. And that was what all those ancient Greek dialogues were about, whether you're talking about Aristotle or, or Plato, or the Sophists. They were in the business of training up Homo sapiens to be humans. And they all had different ways of doing it, and they had different views about who was actually eligible to have this training. Right? The Sophists would train anyone who would pay. Aristotle was a little fussier. Right? That's just kind of how it goes. But the point is, human was always an artificial category. Now, one of the things that interestingly happened, starting with the Stoics, was this idea that humanity was available to everyone in principle because in some sense we had a soul that was a microcosm of the universe. And when you get to Christianity, this becomes an imperative. In other words, there's a sense in which the world is not really complete, not really whole, unless we are all able to realize our humanity and to be treated as equals, as equal brothers under the same God, or equal sisters under the same God. Okay? And that's where you start to get this idea of universal declaration of human rights and things of that kind. And so humanity then becomes not merely this thing that elite people can have if they can be trained properly, but it becomes a kind of collective project of self-improvement that in a way everyone's got to be involved in. And I think, a lot of the stuff that, we still talk about with regard to humanity is of this kind. So we were talking about these smart cities earlier. I think that's still very much in that spirit, right? Where we're in a sense, smart cities with smart people. They can come from any class of society, and we're all part of the same grouping. Now, the thing is, how far do you go with this idea? Now, the crucial aspect of Christianity that matters here, from the standpoint of this development of the history of humanity, is the definition of the human as a creature created in the image and likeness of God. That's a very important point. It isn't just the idea that human beings have souls that somehow are able to reflect the universe, but in some sense we have a special relationship with God. And one of the things that enables us to do is to understand the entire universe and how it works and so forth in principle. Now, I say all this because David, in his introductory remarks, if you were here, made reference to intelligent design. Okay? And I know it's a very controversial word now, but the point that I think is very important here that actually does connect the kinds of things we're concerned with here with this intelligent design that's part of the controversy with evolution these days is the idea that biology is seen as a kind of technology, in the case of intelligent design theorists, divine technology. And that there's some sense in which the kinds of technology that we do is a kind of poorer, but nevertheless the same sort of thing as what God does. And that's why we can kind of be confident in a certain way that by our own technological ingenuity, we can sort of re-engineer the earth and make it more human-friendly. And this is exactly what we've been talking about so far. Right? Where does that confidence come from? It's not a natural thing. Okay, it has to do with our self-conception as human beings. Being created in the image and likeness of God, understood in a strong sense. Because you might say, being created in the image and likeness of God, in a weak sense, would mean we're kind of like a pale copy. We have some divine features, but really they can't quite be compared with God's. No, the operative definition is the one that says that the difference between us and God is a matter of degree, not kind. So God, as it were, is an infinitely better engineer, but he's an engineer. And so in that sense, you can talk about achievable perfection. And a lot of this stuff about enhancement presupposes these kinds of ideas, even if they've dropped the theology out. Okay? And I think that's a really important thing. Now, where do you see more of this kind of thinking? The idea that reality is a code. See, that idea of reality as a code comes from the idea that the Bible is literally God talking to us. Right? And we, according to the, in the ancient way of thinking about what a human being is, what marks us as distinct from other creatures is the logos. We have language. Okay? And then you start to say the whole world's language-like. So we have laws of nature, which we can understand. We have the genetic code. We have computer code. All of those kinds of ideas. Those ideas, people often say, this is just metaphor. Hey, these are metaphors that are pretty powerful. We end up getting a lot of mileage out of these so-called metaphors. Maybe it's literal. At what point do you say it's literal? You see? Now, if you have a certain theological disposition, you say it is. So, for example, perhaps the best-selling intelligent design book is called Signature in the Cell. Okay? And you see, the thing that's interesting about this is, in contrast, Darwin didn't think that there was a logos-like nature to life or anything like that. He didn't think there was a code. He thought the code was just a projection of human fantasy. Now, you might argue that's because he didn't know enough science, but it's not so clear. But the point is, that's kind of it's an interesting aspect, right? Insofar as we believe in that kind of conception of humanity, that we can understand the entire universe, that the whole idea of cosmology of the sort that Newton, Einstein, and Stephen Hawking practice is not just complete lunacy, but actually makes some sense. That we're a creature that can actually solve some of those problems those guys are posing. That presupposes a certain image of what a human being is in nature. And it's one that's quite close to God. And people don't like to say that very explicitly, but look at it the other way. What other motivation would you have for taking that sort of project seriously as something other than fiction? You don't need it to survive in any kind of basic Darwinian sense. Okay? So I do think that there's a real issue here about what a human being is. But that's, of course, not the only future for humanity 2.0. Because, of course, there are a lot of people who do think all of this stuff I've just been talking about is a kind of fantasy and a projection of human hubris, right? And this is the sort of view that, in a sense, humans are anthropocentric and speciest and so forth, and that what humans have to do, especially in light of Darwin, especially in light of our ecological crises and so forth, is reconnect with our animal roots and re-emphasize the fact that there is only a very slight genetic difference between us and all the other animal creatures. Otherwise, we're just going to exterminate everything. Okay? That's the other side of the question. And there, you see, there's a whole different lineage that goes on there. And what I want to say is that we are, especially for people of the younger generation, you've got both of these kinds of trajectories coexisting now. Right? We've got people who are very ardent environmentalists, ecologists, people who are breaking into animal labs because they believe animals are being tortured, and that the feeling of pain is the morally relevant category, and that even if it has to do with human survival, that is not a sufficient reason. That's like the second option I was talking about. And there are others, right, who just want to re-engineer the Earth to make it more human-friendly so that we can have more humans around. And animals, they're second. And this has to do, and what's at stake here is, what do we think it is to be a human being? Which way, are we somehow closer to God? See, the reason why a lot of these people, like Kurzweil and some of the guys you were talking about, are so keen on the singularity, is because, in a sense, these guys don't really believe that our biological natures, as given to us by nature over billions of years of evolution, is really necessary. It's just a historical accident. That once we figure out how evolution works, and especially once we figure out how biology and chemistry and physics works, we can, as it were, take what's best about us, which is imperfectly realized in current wetware, and transfer it to a more durable medium. Right? And that is a very theological ambition. There's no doubt about it. Because what it says is, right, matter is transient. You can have resurrection in a more durable form. Yes. And I really think people need to kind of take that on board, because that's really radically different from the sort of more ecological, environmental vision, which says, look, we're just animals, we're bound to be extinct eventually, and what we need to do is to be able to chill out with our fellow creatures on Earth. Really, and those are two quite different, and they're both coexisting at the moment. And of course, when we use a kind of phrase like post-humanism, right, that's a kind of big tent for everything. Right? Post-humanism is just what goes after this kind of humanity 1.0 classic view that the state preserved. Okay? But we've got a lot of options on the table, and they're not all that obviously compatible with each other, but they all travel under this name of post-humanism. Now, the kind of view that's very theologically inspired is typically called transhumanism. And that was because the idea was, when Julian Huxley coined the term back in the middle third of the 20th century, was that human beings are distinguished from all other animal creatures because we can actually comprehend all of evolution. In other words, it's not just that we can adapt to the environments we happen to be put in, because that's something every creature can do, otherwise they can't survive. No, rather we have a kind of second order knowledge, an awareness of how the whole process works. We have a systems-based knowledge on the basis of which then we can be the custodians of the whole process in the future. And so you won't be surprised to learn Julian Huxley was a supporter of eugenics. He was a pleasant supporter of eugenics within democratic means over a long term, not overnight, etc. But was in fact, that is part of the package. Okay, you just don't leave it to natural selection and genetic variation. You get in there and you organize the process. Okay, that was the original meaning of transhumanism. It is to take what is best about humans that has come out of the evolutionary process and project it into the future. Now, of course, this version of transhumanism, right, came to grief as a result of World War II. And of course, we have the UNESCO Declaration on Race, which Julian Huxley himself was very much involved in, which basically kind of took eugenics off the tables. But now with contemporary transhumanism, and now that a lot of these people who remember that history are dead, right, we are now reinventing a lot of the same issues, and they're real issues, and they're issues worth taking seriously. But we should be mindful of that history. But nevertheless, I do think, my own view is, that some version of the transhumanist agenda is in fact the way to go. Okay, so I'm going to just say that right now, because I've been portraying this in a kind of mixed way, but I'm sort of on that side as opposed to the side that wants us to reconnect with the animals and be species egalitarian. But I want to put it before you that this is in fact quite a fraught political area where people are already kind of voting one way or another even before the science and technology are on board that could justify it. And so I'll stop there and...